So again, welcome. We are so glad that you are here. Tonight we have Al Raddi, and he is going to be doing a presentation for us about Albert Einstein. And Al is a retired social worker who collects topical stamps, first day covers, error coins, vintage magazines, train timetables, and comic book arts. So a little bit of everything. He lives in southeastern Michigan with his wife, Julie, and their Golden Retriever, Gracie. He is a frequent contributor to philatelic and numismatic journals. Love that word. But he has a book, Albert Einstein, a catalog on stamps, and I'll give you more information about that at the end. So, Al, thank you for taking the time to do this, and go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thank you to all of you who zoomed in for this presentation. The presentation is entitled Albert Einstein, His Life on Stamps, and I'm going to share my screen. Hope I can do this with relative ease. So as Jennifer mentioned, my 14-slide presentation this evening is based on my book, Albert Einstein on Stamps, a Catalog. The book was published by the American Topical Association back in 2020. It is for sale on Amazon for 20-something dollars. And all of the proceeds from the sale of the book go to our club. Before I move actually into my presentation, I do want to thank a couple of people. I want to thank Professor Dan Rabinovich. Dan was the editor of the chemistry and physics on stamps topical study group at the time I was writing, and he helped me to write, I think, about 6 articles on Albert Einstein. They appeared in the journal of the study group, and they have been reprinted and are in the back of the book. I also want to thank the very talented Martin Kent Miller. Martin laid out the book and picked what I thought was a very eye-catching cover for the book. On this title slide, there are a couple of stamps that include caricatures of Albert Einstein. The one over on the left was issued by Cuba
Yes, please.
to commemorate the anniversary of Einstein's very short, I think it was just 48-hour visit to Cuba back in, I think it was 1930. And on the right is a very nice stamp issued by Israel substantially later. And this caricature stamp commemorates Albert Einstein's miracle year, 1905. And we're going to talk about that a bit. And we're going to tell some of the things he did during that year. My book has photos and descriptions of nearly 400 stamps that were issued depicting Albert Einstein. They were issued by slightly over 100 different countries over the years. Each stamp has a photo, a Scott number when available, and a description of the stamp. And on the left is that wonderful cover that Martin picked for the stamp. So first, a couple of things. I don't include in the book, and I'm not going to include in this presentation, any stamps that don't actually depict Albert Einstein, but might depict instead something related to him, like stamps with an atomic explosion on it, or stamps with one of his famous formulas like E equals mc squared. I'm also not going to include any souvenir sheets in which Einstein only appears in the margin, but not on the stamp for the souvenir sheet, because you'd be amazed at how many souvenir sheets sort of gratuitously add Albert Einstein. So people like me will buy the stamp even though he's not depicted on it. But I am going to include some controversial stamps, that is, I'm going to include stamps that were issued unofficially. They were issued in the name of a country that may not have a centralized postal service, or they were issued by a private company in the name of a country that may not exist, or maybe even never existed officially. Um, these are sometimes called private issues. In fact, they're basically philatelic fakes, but I am going to include them because there are so many of them. They trade regularly on eBay. They're often very colorful, and sometimes they're very creative. And as we'll see, sometimes they're just plain goofy. So if I were to go through the book as it is set up as a catalog, we'd probably all be bored to death. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some of the stamps that I particularly like, and I'm going to put them in the context of Albert Einstein's life, and then we'll do a couple of special slides at the end for some stamps. So let's delve into the life of Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein's parents were Hermann Einstein and Pauline Koch. They were non-observant Jews. His father was a very good electrical engineer who unfortunately didn't have a head for business, which put a little bit of uncertainty into the Einstein's life. His mother was a very well-educated and quiet woman who had an inclination for the arts. And she was a very talented piano player. So it wasn't surprising that she got Albert started with violin lessons when he was only 5 years old. Here are some stamps depicting Albert Einstein as a violin player. A nice one from the Republic of Togo. Over to the right, there is a depiction of Albert Einstein playing the violin on a stamp from St. Thomas and Principe. And up in the top right-hand corner, I think I can't see what it is, but I think it's from Niger. And it shows him playing the violin. So when I saw that Albert Einstein played violin virtually all of his life, I began to ask, well, was he any good? And it seems from the statements of his contemporaries that he was a really good amateur. He practiced a lot and he enjoyed playing with his friends. So the violin playing was one of two things that he especially liked. And we're going to see the other was sailing. Herman and Pauline married in 1876, and the couple was living in the town of Ulm when Albert was born on March 14th, 1879. Ulm is a small city in the southern part of Germany. It's on the Danube River. It's surrounded by forest and hills, and it is likely the source of Albert Einstein's love of the outdoors. Einstein, until his final days, loved to walk. And as a younger man, when he lived in Germany, he especially loved to sail. He found it relaxing. He found it a wonderful opportunity for him to think, as playing the violin was relaxing for him. The family then moved to Munich, where Albert's father thought he could get a better job. And in Munich, Germany, Einstein's sister, his only sibling, Maria, was born. She was nicknamed Maya. She was born in 1881, and she and Albert were very close through their entire life. In fact, in her later years, she came to live with him when he was living and teaching at Princeton University, and she died in his house a couple of years before he himself died. Here are a couple nice pictures of young Albert and a picture with his sister. And here are a couple of stamps that depict Albert, what I call the young Albert. This stamp from Fiji I particularly like because it's part of a series colorfully done like this in pastels showing Albert Einstein at half a dozen different phases in his life. And this stamp in the upper right, or I should say souvenir sheet, is from Equatorial Guinea, and it uses the photo of young Albert that's over here on the left. Albert Einstein started school at age 5. He attended a Catholic school for 3 years, and then he transferred to the Litpold College Preparation School. And he was there for 7 years in Munich, Germany. It wasn't his favorite place to be. And at age 16, Albert Einstein rebelled against the strict regimen of the school. And he transferred to a school in Switzerland to finish his secondary education. When he graduated what we would call high school, he renounced his German citizenship so he wouldn't have to go into the German army and entered a 4-year program to study mathematics and physics. This program would lead to a teaching credential, which would enable him to teach math and physics. Here are some nice stamps that I think reflect what I call the school age Albert. Here's one from the Republic of Congo depicting him. Guinea-Bissau has a very nice drawing. Jersey issued a stamp, and Switzerland issued a very colorful stamp. I think these are probably all the same photograph used for these stamps. When I was thinking about and learning about Einstein's education, I frequently heard people say that, well, Albert Einstein wasn't a very good student when he was younger. And the idea is that you could inspire youngsters who are not very good students themselves by saying, well, Albert Einstein wasn't very good. You may become great one day too if you stick with it. That simply wasn't true. Albert Einstein did have trouble with language and probably wasn't fluent until he was about 8 years old. However, while he was a student, he was a very good student. Right from the beginning, he read philosophy, and he was particularly good at science and math. I want to go over to this Republic of Congo because I noted that sometimes these private issues or unofficial issues are just plain silly. And a good example is this stamp in the B position or upper right-hand corner, showing Einstein playing an electric guitar and wearing a fiddler's cap, or maybe trying to look like Bob Dylan for all I know. This sort of stuff is prevalent on unofficial stamps. However, right below it is a really nice stamp. It is a photograph of Albert Einstein on board his little sailing ship on the lake beside his house in Kapith, Germany. And this photo was taken by a fine photographer by the name of Lottie Jacobi. It was probably taken about 1930, 31, shortly before he left Germany. And it shows him out just enjoying a nice time on his little sailboat, which he called the Porpoise, and thinking as he liked to do. Einstein said he did his best thinking sometimes when he was just out on the water and musing. In 1900, Albert Einstein passed his exams and he was awarded a teaching diploma. He also married Mileva Merrick, with whom he studied at Zurich Polytechnic. Mileva and Albert had 2 children, Actually, they had three children. If you count the child that they had before they were married, she is sort of a mystery child. Historians didn't even know she existed until the 1960s, well after Einstein had died and Maliva had died back in Slovenia. Nobody really knows what happened to this daughter, other than the best guess is that she was sent to live with Maliva's relatives in Slovenia. They had two children after they were married. Um, his older son, Hans Albert, became a professor of chemistry at the University of California at Berkeley. And his younger son, Edward, unfortunately was sickly. He struggled with mental illness. He was institutionalized and he died relatively young. Albert Einstein never really had a lot to do with his sons, especially Edward, but he wrote frequently to Edward, and we'll have a little reference to that later. So he cared about his children, but he just had other things to do in his mind. After graduation from Zurich Polytechnic, unfortunately, as bright as Einstein was, he simply couldn't find a job back in Germany where he had hoped to move. The reason he couldn't find a job is because he had not gone to school in Germany. And the way things work there is that you went to school in Germany, you built relationship with your professors, you found mentors, and those people then found and helped you to move into jobs in teaching positions. And if you had not gone through that system and developed the connections and the mentors, it was virtually impossible to find a job in teaching physics or math in Germany. So what he did was, having children and or at least at the time, a wife to support, he took a job in the patent office in Bern, Switzerland, a job that one of his classmates' father got for him. It was not a particularly challenging job. He was in Bern and he reviewed patents, which he was very capable of doing. And fortunately, it was not a very demanding job. During his time in the patent office, he was able to work on his doctorate, and he was also able to write. And in 1905, Albert Einstein had his miracle year, a year in which he wrote and published 4 papers, which essentially transformed the way we see the universe. These are some nice stamps. This little series from Serbia shows Albert and Mileva, probably in a different photo setting than this photo here because of his type of collar and her dress. And up in the right-hand corner is a very nice stamp from Argentina. And I like it because the background is the journal in which Albert Einstein's 4 world-changing articles were published in 1905, his miracle year. So let's look at those articles. And I'm not a physicist, but I will do my best to give an idea of what they were about. The first paper that Albert Einstein published during his miracle year was on the photoelectric effect. And it is referenced in this stamp published by the Republic of Argentina. His key insight was that light consists of discrete packets or quanta of energy called photons. And this theory contradicted what was the prevailing theory of the time, namely that light was a wave. Ironically, in proposing this theory that light is in small packets or quanta, he pretty much laid the groundwork for quantum mechanics, which he never trusted and wrote against for the rest of his life. The second paper, which is referenced in this Republic of Congo stamp, was on Brownian motion. Physicists knew that particles suspended in a fluid moved about in a random motion, but they weren't quite sure why this happened. And Einstein said the reason this is happening is that they're being constantly bumped by molecules and atoms. Now, this doesn't seem too groundbreaking, except that at the time he wrote this, the whole theory of atoms was still debated. And this paper gave pretty good evidence that the theory of atoms was correct. The third paper he wrote, all of this in the same year for the same journal, which is pointed to or referenced on this stamp from Romania, gave his special theory of relativity. And in this special theory of relativity, he said that time and space were not separate entities. They were actually woven together in one to become the fabric of the universe, which is really space-time. And because the laws of the universe and the speed of light are same for all observers in the universe, no matter where they are and how fast they're moving, there were strange relative measurements of things like time and mass and length. So we hear, although very few of us have the ability to understand, that, for example, a person traveling close to the speed of light out in space will actually not age as fast as a person back on Earth. That person's clock will appear perfectly good to him or her, and it will appear to be running just the way it would have been back on Earth, but in fact, it is running slower relative to a clock running on Earth. So a person who goes out into outer space for a whole bunch of years may come back much younger than his contemporary who spent all the time on Earth. So that was his theory of special relativity. His fourth paper was sort of an extension of that theory of special relativity, and that idea is depicted on this stamp from China. He basically said if special relativity is true, then energy and matter are equivalent. And the conversion of the two is determined by the speed of light squared. So energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, or mass equals energy divided by the speed of light squared. This is probably the world's most famous equation. And ironically, it appears absolutely nowhere in any of Albert Einstein's writings. Other equations, which convey the same meaning, appear, but E equals mc squared doesn't appear in any of his writing. Just as a quick aside, years ago, I had bought a couple of Albert Einstein manuscripts, and I had become a good friend of a manuscript dealer. And one day he showed me a little piece of paper, kind of a clip, and on it was typed, my theory of relativity is E equals mc squared. And it was signed Albert Einstein. And I looked at it, and it sure looked like an original Albert Einstein signature. So I asked my friend, is this original? He says, well, yes, it is in a way. The signature of Albert Einstein is true, but it is clipped off a letter, and somebody used a typewriter to type E equals mc squared on it, which we know that Einstein never used. And secondly, it's typed with a Selectric typewriter, IBM Selectric typewriter, which wasn't invented till about 10 years after Albert Einstein died. So I didn't buy the manuscript. Those four papers in 1905 catapulted Einstein into the genius category. Not only did he publish these four papers, but 10 years later, he published his greatest discovery. That is the theory of general relativity. People say that sort of special relativity was in the air at the time he discovered it, but it is doubtful that anybody would have at the time created general relativity 10 years later. Uh, what Albert Einstein did was he moved gravity into his special relativity. What had happened was a few hundred years earlier, Isaac Newton had developed these very elegant equations that told how gravity worked. And they were elegant, they were extremely practical. They worked for cannonballs, they worked for the movements of constellations. However, Isaac Newton never asked the question, well, what is gravity? What is this mysterious action that occurs at a distance instantaneously? In fact, Isaac Newton, in one of his papers, said, I don't know what this is, and I'm not going to look into it. That will be for my readers to figure out. Well, Albert Einstein did read Newton, and he figured it out, and his answer was there is no force of gravity. There is no action at a distance that is immediate. The way the fabric of space works is that mass, planets, stars, anything in space, causes space to curve. And those items in space follow those curves. They try to go straight, but the space is curved. It's sort of like when you fly from New Zealand to South Carolina. You may plot it out and say, well, I'm just going straight, and you draw a straight line. But in fact, when you make that flight, you fly an arc. And the reason you fly an arc is that the Earth is curved. So, because of these discoveries, Albert Einstein was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1921. Here is a nice souvenir sheet from Santa Lucia, which shows Albert Einstein as the recipient of the Nobel Prize in 1921. There are no photos of Albert Einstein receiving the Nobel Prize. You would think one of them would be used on a stamp. The reason there are no photos is that he did not go to the ceremony. Instead, he went to Japan. And he had planned a trip to Japan, which could have been deferred very easily. But he went to Japan instead of the Nobel Prize ceremony. And I think the reason he went was he was miffed. One, he had been working for 16 years. And finally, they're going to give him the Nobel Prize. But even more importantly, he was probably denied the Nobel Prize because of anti-Semitism. And so he boycotted the Nobel Prize ceremony. Another reason he boycotted it or didn't go to it was he wasn't going to get any money from it. The Nobel Prize that year had a prize of about $250,000. And actually, two prizes were given, one to Niels Bohr and one to Albert Einstein. And the prize was about $250,000. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you frame it, when he divorced Maliva Merrick, he told her, I don't have much money. I'll do the best I can to support the kids, but I'll tell you what I'll give you. I'm certain I'm going to win the Nobel Prize, and probably pretty quickly. So you can have all the Nobel Prize money. So the Nobel committee sent the money to Maliva Merrick, his ex-wife, as part of their divorce settlement. And by the way, Einstein did not receive the Nobel Prize for his work on special or general relativity. He was given the Nobel Prize for his work on the photoelectric effect. The committee said, well, this is kind of controversial, so let's give it to him. Kind of ties in with quantum mechanics. We're going to give a prize to Niels Bohr too. So let's just kind of make this a quantum mechanics thing and avoid some of the controversy that might have been involved with relativity. Having divorced Maliva Merrick, Albert Einstein married Elsa Lowenthal. Elsa Lowenthal's name, Lowenthal, came from her first husband. Her maiden name was Elsa Einstein, and she was, in fact, Albert Einstein's first cousin. So he married Elsa. Elsa brought with him two daughters, Ilsa and Margot, to the marriage. And here are some stamps that, well, first there's a nice picture of Albert and Elsa perhaps coming to this country on board ship. Here is a picture from Angola with Albert and Elsa, and a souvenir sheet from Romania depicting Albert and his second wife, Elsa, then Lowenthal, and a sheet of stamps, one of which shows Albert Einstein with his wife, Elsa Lowenthal. So in 1931, I believe it was, Einstein, who was teaching in Berlin at the time, had an opportunity to come to the United States as a guest lecturer at the California Institute of Technology, which I think is located in Pasadena. So he took the opportunity. He came to the United States. He taught at Caltech. Unfortunately, while he was gone, the Nazis, who didn't like him at all, confiscated his property, including his sailboat, and told him he wasn't welcome back in Germany. So Einstein decided that he would just stay in the United States. And he took a position at Princeton University's Center for Advanced Studies. Fairly quickly, he and his secretary, who had moved with him, Helen Dukas, became United States citizens. Now, here are some stamps that kind of capture that part of Albert Einstein's life. This is a photo of Albert Einstein walking from his house on Mercer Street on the Princeton campus, something he loved to do when the weather permitted it. That stamp is, that picture is used on a stamp, which on my view here is hidden a little bit, issued by Equatorial Guinea, showing him walking to work. Here is a stamp issued unofficially by Djibouti, showing him teaching. I doubt that it is an actual, it's a photo. I doubt that it's a drawing based on an actual photo, because we see equals MC squared, and I'm not sure that Einstein would be sitting on his desk in his classes. And over on the right is a stamp that shows him or portrays him teaching at his classes at Princeton's Center for Advanced Studies. In 1939, Albert Einstein signed a letter that was written by the physicist Leo Szilard. And in this letter, Einstein told President Roosevelt that it would be possible to build a very powerful atomic bomb. In fact, the Nazis were already working on it. Roosevelt then pulled together the Manhattan Project. A bomb was built and was used. Einstein never worked on the atom bomb himself. He didn't want to. It wasn't something he was interested in doing. Practical physics. He was a theoretician. The other thing is he probably would not have been allowed to work on it. J. Edgar Hoover wasn't a big fan of Albert Einstein. Um, Einstein's subsequent pacifism, his German roots, he was probably a little too suspect to get a security clearance. But in any case, he did not work on the atomic bomb, but he's often associated with it. We see some nice stamps from Antigua and Barbuda, in which Albert Einstein is portrayed along with the atomic explosion. And here is a stamp from Sierra Leone, which features Albert Einstein working with J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the director of the Manhattan Project. We see the atomic explosion in the background. It probably is based on a photo. Einstein and Oppenheimer did work together at Princeton after World War II, but they weren't of the same generation. They weren't interested in the same things. And although they worked together as colleagues, probably weren't the greatest of friends. While he was teaching, Einstein had students, not a lot of them. Most of them couldn't understand him. His accent was very heavy, and also his thinking was so complex that very few people could understand him. He taught, he continued to write. His life quest was to develop a grand unified theory which combined all the known forces of nature, gravity, electromagnetism, and both the strong and weak atomic forces. He never achieved his grand unified theory, but he worked on it very hard. And while he was working on it, he also advocated for pacifism and socialism and humanism and Zionism. This is a photo of Einstein with an NBC microphone in front of him, giving a talk on the peaceful use of atomic energy. A nice little souvenir sheet from Aitutaki shows Einstein and suggests his connections with the peaceful use of nuclear energy and not the violent use of it. Here are a couple of souvenir sheets that depict him with the very first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, because Einstein was a very passionate Zionist. He was probably offered the presidency of Israel when Israel was formed, but he turned it down. He wasn't a politician. It was a largely ceremonial job, and it would have distracted him from the kinds of things that he wanted to do. So Einstein continued his life at the Center for Advanced Studies in Princeton, and in 1955, he died when a blood vessel burst near his heart. He had a modest funeral service. His ashes were scattered in an unknown place, but his brain was preserved for science. And the study of that brain shows that Einstein probably had a slightly larger, or did have a slightly larger prefrontal cortex than average. He had wider parietal lobes, and he probably had more than average tightly packed neurons, but none of these things were particularly dramatic. And as far as we know, Albert Einstein's brain was pretty much like yours and mine. I'd like to look at some photos of Albert Einstein just quickly as we finish up here, because some photos were used very frequently on stamps depicting the great man. Einstein himself didn't like photographers. He called them light monkeys. And I think it's because they just bothered him too much. But he did occasionally sit for a portrait. And this portrait in the upper left was done by Philippe Hausmann. And Hausmann reports that when he went to Einstein's study at his home in Princeton, Einstein was, during the session, talking a lot about his despair that his formula E equaled MC squared and his letter to Roosevelt caused the death of so many people throughout the world. And Hausman said that when he actually flipped the shutter to take this picture, he said that Einstein's eyes had a sense of immense sadness. And I think that is captured nicely here. The United States issued 2 stamps depicting Albert Einstein. This is the first one issued in 1966 as part of the Prominent Americans series. Uses the Hausman photograph. It was the 3rd stamp issued ever to commemorate him. Next to it is a stamp from Israel, which used the Hausman photograph. This is the first stamp issued in 1955 that commemorated him. To the right is a kind of a childish drawing of the Hausman photograph, a stamp from Zaire. It issued a whole bunch of these in various denominations and just changed the background color slightly on the stamps. Over to the right is a nice drawing based on the photograph of a stamp issued by Monaco. Sweden also issued a stamp. Ghana issued a stamp, changing his cotton sweatshirt to a nice suit coat. This was the 2nd stamp ever issued to commemorate Albert Einstein, and it was issued in connection with UNESCO. And this is a nice high contrast stamp issued by San Marino, in which the sweatshirt is also taken off to kind of give a more formal open collar look. Another famous photograph of Albert Einstein was taken a couple of years later by the great photographer Joseph Karsh. It too was taken at Einstein's house in Princeton. He's wearing his sweatshirt. Why exactly he wore sweatshirts, I'm not positive. One thought is that Albert Einstein had a mild allergy to wool, and one of his fans sent him some cotton sweatshirts, which he enjoyed wearing comfortably. However, there are a lot of photos of Albert Einstein in his earlier years wearing wool suits, so he could have developed a wool allergy as he got older. He enjoyed sweatshirts much like I do every day. And Hausman took this picture of Einstein, and he said that when he was taking the picture, Einstein's whole demeanor seemed almost childlike, but his face had what Karsh called a rough grandeur. And this picture was used by India, was used by Niger, was used by Ghana, was used by Mali, was used by Tanzania, it was used by Macedonia, and it was used by Grenada, possibly the best known photograph of Albert Einstein. Now, I want to finish up with just a couple other photographs. In addition to these formal photographs, there were a couple of snapshots taken of Albert Einstein, which I think many of you will recognize. The first is of Albert Einstein riding a bicycle. This was taken while he was teaching at Caltech. It was taken in the front yard or at the home of one of the trustees of the universe, I think either in Santa Barbara or Pasadena. And this is a fun photo. It's often shown in connection with a quote from Albert Einstein. Albert wrote in one of his letters to his son, Edward, "Life is like riding a bicycle. To keep your balance, you must keep moving forward." And this picture of Albert Einstein is kind of replicated humbly on this stamp by Central Republic of Africa. It's also used in this stamp from Angola, and it's used against some very grandiose backgrounds by Mexico, by Portugal, by the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it's also used in a stamp that has almost cosmic implications in the back. And finally, certainly the best known snapshot of Albert Einstein ever taken. Albert Einstein had just celebrated his 72nd birthday. I think the president of Princeton and the president's wife had taken him to dinner at the Princeton Club for the celebration. And when he left to come out to their car, the car was swamped by paparazzi. And one of them, by the name of Arthur Sass, took this picture in 1951. Albert Einstein was fed up with all these people who were blocking his car and snapping flash bulbs, so he simply stuck out his tongue at them. And this famous picture has been cropped and put on stamps by countries like Liberia and Zanzibar, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Equatorial Guinea, and Mali. So, as Forrest Gump would say, that's all I have to say about that. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Al. That was fabulous.
Yeah, thank you.
Fabulous. I had one question in the chat, and the one question I have was, is Einstein the scientist with the largest number of stamps?
Yes, he probably is. I don't know who has the largest number of stamps total. I would say Queen Victoria, or I'd probably put my money on Elizabeth II. But I think that Albert Einstein is maybe number 3 total, and definitely the scientist with the most number of stamps depicting him. He really got a boost. When I first started collecting, there were only 12. But when he became Time Magazine's Man of the Century, that was a big boost too. And of course, in 2005 and 2015, those centennials of his great moments produced a lot of stamps too.
Just a quick comment. I saw also during the presentation, I searched the database for Nobel Prize nominations. And Einstein was nominated for the Nobel Prize 66 times, including 14 times in 1921, the year he got the prize. So he had been extensively nominated. Some nominations came from other Nobel laureates, and he was like overdue for a Nobel Prize. And surprisingly, after he got the Nobel Prize in 1921, he was nominated again a few times in 1922 and 1923. Maybe those are late arrivals of those nominations, but he got it in 1921, like I'll mention.
Thanks, Dan. And because we have a couple of minutes, let me just add a little something there. Einstein probably didn't get the prize initially because, frankly, nobody understood what he had done. Very few people understood his theory. When people began to understand it, I think there was a genuine question, was this really a discovery? It was supposed to be a Nobel Prize for discovery. Was this a discovery? Was it a theory? And also, how would you ever prove or disprove it? What if they gave him the Nobel Prize and it later turned out that it was wrong? So things were slowed down initially for those two reasons, but eventually there were some very hardcore anti-Semitic members of the committee, and they simply did not want a person who practiced what they called Jewish science. There were two kinds of science: German science, which was empirical, it was rigorous, it was experimental. Then there was this thing called Jewish science, and it was more like philosophy, and it wasn't real science. And they weren't about to give it to this Jew at this time, and they were very vocal. It wasn't until finally the pressure became, as Dan alluded, so great, so many nominations that they had to give it to him. And then they kind of slipped by and gave it to him, not for relativity, although relativity had been empirically proven at that time. They gave it to him because he was sort of like a quantum physicist.
We really appreciate you taking the time to put all that together. That was a lot of information, a lot of work. So that was great. That was great. Well, thank you, everybody. Good to see you, and I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to see
So,
you. Bye-bye.
yep. Thanks for coming.